We're going to go ahead and start. We may have a few other people joining us during the course of the event. But first I want to introduce myself. My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network here at ODI. And I'd like to welcome all of you and all of the people online to today's launch of the 71st edition of the Humanitarian Exchange magazine, and the theme of which is the crisis in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. I think you've all got copies of it on your chairs. The Lake Chad Basin, as I think most of you know, is one of the most overlooked humanitarian crises today, where around 17 million people across northeastern Nigeria, Cameroon's far north, western Chad, and southeast Niger are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance and protection. There are about 7.2 million dependent on food aid. And the Boko Haram attacks and counterinsurgency campaign have displaced at least 2.4 million people, and the vast majority of whom are in the northeastern Nigerian states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, where humanitarian access is restricted. Attacks against civilians are increasing, and unsafe conditions in displacement sites, insecurity, and systemic patterns of sexual exploitation and abuse related to the lack of sufficient food and other humanitarian assistance persists. Underlying the current crisis is a history of political and economic marginalization, poor governance, and environmental degradation. And many people are living in desperate conditions without access to food or clean water. And malnutrition rates are alarmingly high. Outbreaks of hepatitis E, malaria, and cholera in northeast Nigeria and Niger have exacerbated the really difficult conditions in the region. And so today, drawing on articles in the Humanitarian Exchange and their own experiences, our panelists are going to discuss the current humanitarian development challenges in the region, including issues of protection and humanitarian access, the Boko Haram crisis, and why it took so long for the humanitarian system to recognize the crisis and mount an effective response. But before I introduce our speakers, can I just remind you to put your phones on silent, but feel free to tweet using the hashtag Lake Chad Crisis. And I'll be taking questions and comments from our audience, both in the room and online, following the panel discussion. So hold your thoughts and questions for now. Now, moving to our panelists, we have an extremely interesting group of panelists and contributors today. And we'll be starting with a video message from Jan Eggland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Jan has recently returned from the region, but wasn't able to be with us today. Immediately before joining NRC as Secretary General in 2013, Jan Eggland was the Europe Director of Human Rights Watch and the Executive Director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. From 2003 to 2006, he was the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Jan has also acted as the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on Colombia, was the Secretary General of the Norwegian Red Cross, State Secretary in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for several years, and he's held numerous other high-level positions. He's also initiated and fostered several critical peace processes during his career. So we were very grateful to Jan for taking the time to actually record a video message for us, and he's recently returned from the region. Joining us by video link from Afghanistan, you'll see on your screens, is Toby Lanzer, the Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan in the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, or UNAMA, as well as the United Nations Resident Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator, and resident representative of the United Nations Development Program. That's a lot of titles, Toby. Toby has a wealth of experience in development, humanitarian affairs, and peacekeeping since first joining UNDP in 1992. And his most recent positions have included Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for the Sahel, Deputy Special Representative, Resident Coordinator, and Humanitarian Coordinator in the United Nations Mission in South Sudan, or UNMISS, and Chief of Staff of the United Nations Integrated Mission in Timor-Leste. He's also served with the United Nations in Georgia, the Russian Federation, and Switzerland. And we're really grateful to Toby for taking time out of his very busy schedule to join us today. So thank you, Toby. To my left is Joe Reed, who's my co-editor for this edition and co-author of an article, and the co-chair of the Lake Chad Basin Working Group in Washington, D.C., where she works with CARE USA as a global advocacy advisor. Jo began working on the displacement crisis in northeast Nigeria in May 2014 as the West Africa Regional Analyst at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva. And at IDMC, she led research and analysis on the Boko Haram crisis. From IDMC, she joined the OCHA office in Nigeria as a humanitarian affairs officer, where she served as the OCHA focal point for protection of civilians and humanitarian access. Since leaving OCHA in February 2016, Jo's continued her research and writing about the displacement crisis in northeast Nigeria and became co-chair of the Lake Chad Basin Working Group in May 2017. And joining us, we hope, at some point by phone line from Rome is Chitra Nagarajan, who is the senior advisor leading on CIVIC, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, programs in Borno, northeast Nigeria. And we were hoping that Chitra was going to be with us today, but there were various issues with her travel permissions, so she wasn't able to make it in person. But we're trying to get her by phone line. So the programs are supporting civil-military relations, training, research, and advocacy to prevent and address civilian harm in the ongoing conflict. And Chitra has specialist knowledge and experience of peace and security, gender and human rights and humanitarian law, having spent almost 15 years working in programming, policy, and advocacy in a whole range of countries. And before joining CIVIC, Chitra worked for the Nigeria Stability and Reconciliation Program, the Gender Action for Peace and Security, International Alert, and UNIFEM, which is now UN Women. And last but not least, on my right, is John Bilo, and he's the Director of Adaptive Programs at the IRC, International Rescue Committee, and leads the organization's efforts to become more adaptive. He founded and co-led the ADAPT collaboration with Mercy Corps and co-wrote the Adapting Aid Report. John also currently serves as the Deputy Director of the newly established Humanitarian Learning Center, which is a collaboration between the IRC, the Institute of Development Studies, and Crown agents. And he previously was the IRC's Deputy Regional Director for West Africa. And John has 16 years of experience working in and supporting programs in about 19 countries across 4 continents. Pretty impressive. So without further ado, we'd like to play Jan Eggland's video message for you, and then we're going to move into a discussion with our panelists. So could we have the video, please?
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to this important ODI humanitarian exchange on the Lake Chad crisis. I am very happy to see that my good friend Toby Lancer will be speaking at the event along with colleagues from IRC and CARE that are very active in the theater of operations. I came just back myself from Maiduguri, the provincial capital of Borno State, and I was also in Munguno, a small border town in the extreme north of this war-torn part of Nigeria. And I have 4 impressions, strong impressions with me back. The first one is that civilians are again increasingly targeted. Every single day when we were there were reports of attack somewhere within Borno State, and it was always and uniformly against the civilian populations. So that leads to my second point. It's not yet possible for the internally displaced people, 1.7 million or so, nor for most of the refugees to return. They're simply too scared to return to their ancestral land. We did a survey, NRC, with the REACH initiative and DRC. We surveyed 3,400 households. It represents 27,000 people. It's the biggest and most representative survey of its kind. The overwhelming majority, well over 80%, said that this is not the time to return because it's not safe to return. a majority said they would be willing and interested to return when the time is ripe and when it is safe. I think this is a very strong signal, both to the government and to us as humanitarian actors, that we have to plan for a better and safer framework of returns. I met very many families, and it stuck to me especially what one elderly widow told me. She had come to Mongono town with her two widowed daughters. Both of her sons-in-law had been killed by the Boko Haram. She said, I want to return. I have land there. There are houses, or there were houses that were torched there, but I will go back home when the elders in my community return, when the local authorities return, when there is some law and order, and when there is a school for my children and grandchildren. And none of this is there at the moment. My third point is also connected to this. The protection crisis is now much larger than the assistance crisis. A lot has happened, thanks to the people in the panel, among others, in the last 12, 18 months. An epic famine was looming. There was not a large assistance program at all. Now millions have been received by assistance. The humanitarian community, so-called, has gone from a very small one in Maiduguri and in the provincial towns just a year ago to, I think, around 500 international staff and thousands of local good and courageous field workers. But we're still not able to protect people outside of the towns, outside of the urban areas. Mongono town in the north is a place with a trench around it, and beyond the trench, it's sort of lawlessness. It's sort of the Wild West beyond belief, really. It's not safe. So, protection crisis has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed in a very robust dialogue with all the power and influence in the region, first and foremost local and national governments. And then final point is that the durable solutions that we as humanitarians should seek along with development partners have to be planned carefully now. We have to define what is really voluntary return, what is assisted and protected and monitored returns, how can livelihoods be created and nurtured and maintained, how can there be schools and healthcare in places where there is nothing but torched houses at the moment. So I wish you all the best in discussing this at this important event.
To set the scene. And as Jan said, although a lot has been done and many more agencies engaged over the last 12 to 18 months, I don't mind telling you that when we were advertising this event, some of the feedback we got from people was, well, I'm sorry, I can't come because it's not a priority for us at the moment. So that's why we've also called it a forgotten crisis. And that only serves to re-emphasize that. Now, I'd like to turn to Toby, who wrote the lead article for the Humanitarian Exchange. And Toby, in your article, you identified a series of factors which have contributed to the crisis in the Lake Chad Basin, including political and economic marginalization, poor governance, and insecurity. And I wondered if you could, you've also talked about in the article why you thought it took so long, but I wondered if you could tell us, why do you think it took so long for the international community to acknowledge the gravity of the crisis and even longer to engage?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to you, Wendy, and to all of your colleagues for the chance to participate in this event. I'd love to be in London, but here I am in Kabul. But it's really good connecting in this way and giving a plug for a region of the world which, as you've just said, is overlooked. And I'm going to talk about that and make a couple of other points. I think one, and by the way, I'm going to do this in a way which may provoke a reaction from the audience. There'll be people who disagree or say, well, that's not good enough. Fine. I'm very happy to have a conversation about this and to generate some thinking and to be tested and questioned on what I'm saying. It is as I saw it. I think one, let me start with why the response was so slow. I think if you ask your average person, where is the Lake Chad Basin, they probably scratch their head and many wouldn't know. And then, if you say, well, where is Nigeria? Well, that's somewhere in Africa. Where is Diffa? Fewer takers on that one. Where is Western Chad? Where is the north of Cameroon? The simple answer is it's 1 million miles away. Now, it's 1 million miles away from London and Kabul and Tokyo and other areas, but it's even 1 million miles away from Niamey, capital of Niger. It's 1 million miles away from Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. And when I say that, I mean it's 1 million miles away for the policymakers and the people who have got their hands on resources. And in that regard, I think it's 1 million miles away politically. If you were to go to Cameroon, I'm not at all convinced that President Biya is particularly concerned about the welfare of people of Cameroon living in the far north of the country. There are political reasons for that. So, figuratively, literally, it is 1 million miles away. I think another reason, and this is more inward-looking perhaps, is whether you're working for CARE or working for UNICEF or working for ECHO, you're busy. And you're busy with the crisis of the day. I imagine right now lots of people in capitals and lots of people in aid agencies are busy with the Rohingya crisis. And a few months ago, they would have been busy with this one for a short time, perhaps. And at the same time, Syria has been on the boil for so long. And if you look back over the last 10 years, typically there will be 2, 3, perhaps 4 big crises which really consume, I think is the word, consume almost all of our attention. And that's the people who practice this profession, who stand for boys and girls, women and men who don't have a voice and who are really stuck in the middle of a conflict or in the middle of a natural disaster. Going on, I think there was a very comfortable excuse in the case of the Lake Chad Basin amongst policymakers and even within aid agencies that, oh, well, this is Nigeria, this is an oil-rich country, lots of resources, why me, why us? And I think that there's a real hole in that argument. Just after I was engaged in the middle of 2015, oil production in Nigeria plummeted right at the same time that the price of oil or petroleum plummeted, and Nigeria's treasury was verging on empty. And the IMF at one stage said this is a country that can barely pay salaries, let alone engage and handle a crisis of the scale that we were witnessing in the Northeast. And my final point is that, if you happen to be working for the UN or an NGO in a country like Nigeria, well, the chances are that you went there with a development agenda. You didn't necessarily go there with an agenda to engage in relief or protecting people who, as Jan just described so ably, are being attacked. You're just not that person who would call attention to that issue. And so I think those are some of the reasons why the response was slow, and to a certain extent may still be so. My second point, how much time have I got, Wendy, before I embark?
Yeah, some 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay, great. So my second point is, okay, now what? You know, how do we fix this? And that's a very comfortable question. People look at us, we talk about humanitarian crises, and I actually think we need to change the parameters of that question. We will never fix it. And I actually would suggest to some that we not call this a humanitarian crisis, because the crisis, the drivers of this, are, as I describe in the article, marginalization, poor governance, climate change, violent extremism, abject poverty, demographic expansion, unlike that, is being witnessed almost anywhere else. You know, to fix this, we need to have people who can address the main drivers which are creating suffering. To fix this, we need to tackle the guys with the guns who are attacking civilians, as Jan just said. Now, lots of humanitarians will say, well, that's not my job. Well, it's not my job as a humanitarian coordinator to tackle climate change or to address abject poverty, agreed, but it's certainly my job to call attention to the drivers of a crisis and to hold those responsible accountable, and to call on them to change their behavior, to invest as a responsible president should in one's people, to make sure that resources are allocated to all regions of a country and that no particular region is marginalized, etc., etc. And there I think there's a massive advocacy role for us as NGOs, as UN agencies, to be far more demanding of the other parts of the international system and of host governments to play their, to do their part and to play their role. And there I would challenge that we have been a little too timid, not only here, but in other contexts. And there are good reasons for that. I'm currently working in a country where we've had 100 attacks on medical facilities in the last 9 months. It's absolutely abominable and disgraceful that any man with a gun would attack a doctor or fire at a patient, but it happens. We have to talk about these things. We have to place this on the agenda and call a spade a spade. My last point is that if we do not advocate, address the drivers, I guarantee all of you one thing. We'll be talking about this crisis again in 3 years' time, in 6 years' time, in 15 years' time. You know, just in the same way that, sadly, we're still talking about Somalia. You know, that's a country that went into meltdown in the early 1990s, and here we are. We'll be talking about South Sudan for years to come, unless in that particular case, you know, we help get boys and girls through quality education, etc. So in all of these settings, my biggest fear is that we treat this as, well, we'll do what we can, we'll throw some humanitarian money at it, but if we do only that, we're, I think, not living up to the real spirit of people's rights, and we're not really standing with those who have a voice. And we need to demand more from many who work in various spheres, whether it's the security front, on issues of climate change, eradicating poverty under the banner of the SDGs, etc. So there's some food for thought for all of you. Jan mentioned, and I'll finish with this, people aren't ready to return. Well, guess what, Jan? They won't be next year, or the year after, or the year after. They won't return. I've been saying this now for nearly 4 years in various contexts. Generally, very few people ever go home. And so there again, I think the humanitarian ethos should be doing much more to call on actors such as the World Bank to say, aha, well, you've got 1 million extra people in Maiduguri. What about water and sanitation, education and health services, so that that city can cope responsibly with what is a new population which is stuck and staying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby. Yeah, it's interesting, the point about the need to attract these, to look at some of these difficult issues and attract development funding. There's an interesting article in the Exchange by Natalie Roberts from MSF, who talks a little bit about this contradiction, you know, of MSF deciding to raise the alarm and portraying this as an acute crisis which had suddenly developed when they knew that it hadn't, that it had been a long-standing issue, that there were many historical drivers of the current situation, but they felt the only way to draw attention to that was to portray it as an acute nutritional crisis. And Natalie says in her article that she thinks that worked, drew attention, and actually brought resources, but that is the wrong narrative. And so at some point we have to try to reconcile those things. Joe, did you want to comment at all, or before I move on?
Well, I think just to come in on, as Toby was mentioning, in some of the reasons why we didn't see as much attention earlier on in the crisis, when we had, the National Commission for Refugees said there were 1.5 million IDPs in February of 2014. And so when we think of how long it took us to get to this discussion and the arrival and the scale-up of a lot of UN offices in 2015, I think that's actually quite a long period of time to contend with. And I would just add to Toby's observations that I think within the region, including with the UN Regional Office for West and Central Africa, they were not only dealing with the Ebola crisis, but of course the Central Africa Republic crisis, the refugee dimensions of which were affecting and continue to affect some of the countries in the region, notably Cameroon. And I think that in addition, not instead of the reasons that Toby has pointed to, I think that there was not so much a lack of strategic capacity, but perhaps too much going on at the same time for the scale of the crisis in all around the Lake Chad Basin, and particularly the crisis in northeast Nigeria as information slowly became available. I think the crisis was having to compete with the sheer numbers and the scale of not only the developing and the intensifying crisis in the Central African Republic, but of course the Ebola crisis, which in 2014 I think had a profound effect on the humanitarian system as a whole, and of course the impact that's had on WHO has continued with the change management process. It's had a huge impact there, but I think it really was a seismic moment for us in the humanitarian community. As someone who just left South Sudan in early 2014, to start working on a crisis in Nigeria and find that we were talking about numbers above 1 million of IDPs, and we didn't have registered, formalized, that is to say, IDP camps in place, was very shocking. And I think it has taken a number of years for the sort of relative numbers to even out in that way to get that attention.
Joe, did you want to comment?
Well, I'd echo all that Joe's just said. I think just kind of reflecting on my role during that time, mobilising the financial resources and the human resources to respond to all of those different crises at the same time is really considerable. And so that was a big issue. As Toby was speaking, I was thinking about this crisis and how it's evolved. And back in 2013, when IRC started programming in Difa, it was an invisible crisis. We're now calling it an overlooked crisis, and as Toby made reference to Somalia, it seems as though there's a risk it will become a forgotten crisis.
Joe, I want to move to you now. Your article that you wrote for us focuses on sexual violence and the Boko Haram crisis. And I wondered if you could tell us about the impact of this violence and the challenges of delivering protection and support for women and girls in northeast Nigeria, especially in camp-like settings.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I would really point everyone towards a fine article by Luana Giardinelli, who is a clinical psychologist who is working with the IOM Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Program in northeast Nigeria. And this was a program funded by USAID at the same time that they were developing the displacement tracking matrix that was originally began working with communities in Chibok, who are, of course, very impacted by the abduction of a whole class of girls at the secondary school there, and then moved out to work with women who were in IDP camps in Adamawa and in Borno states. And as her article documents, the effects on men, women, boys and girls were felt differently, and there was an overriding focus perhaps on the loss of identity, and particularly the displacement from livelihoods issues that were affecting men, whereas the issues that were affecting women, which were in many cases exacerbated by camp policies that involved separation of families as they were gender segregated at that time and continue to be in some cases now, that the distress caused by women who were separated from, in many cases, their male children of 6 or 7 years old. And in cases where families and households had already been separated during displacement journeys, perhaps during security screening, where their male family members perhaps were detained, or in cases where male family members had fled earlier across the border to Cameroon, for example, or did indeed be killed by Boko Haram, the breakdown of family and more broadly community protection mechanisms caused a huge amount of distress to women. And I think a lot of the issues that we've seen in camp-like situations, and we do use that term camp-like because very few of these camps were formal settings for a number of years. People were living in church compounds, people were living in primary schools, and in many cases, even within host communities, people would form an impromptu camp setting. And I think that the exploitation, as well as the broader violence and the impact of those unmet needs, metastasized together, and I think created really big challenges for agencies that were working in the protection sector to go into these environments where we didn't have basic needs provided for. And of course, in terms of psychological first aid, it is very important to make sure that you're not just providing counselling and psychosocial support, you are providing food and water, because people need a level of stability in order to better process and cope with traumatic events. And as a result, I think for protection actors and the conversations that I was party to in the protection working group from 2014, 2015 through to 2016, I think we really face challenges in not only accessing information and regular access to a lot of these camp-like settings, but the magnitude of the focus on water and sanitation in these sites made it very difficult to push through and to make the case that psychosocial support and protection interventions were also a priority. Such was the competition between the different priorities and the sort of ring fencing of the life-saving sectors, of which protection wasn't considered to be one.
Is this why humanitarian agencies didn't respond to the protection crisis before the scale-up of Boko Haram violence? I mean, despite the fact that there were 1.5 million displaced at the time? I
think if we look earlier in the crisis, before the scale-up that took place from April 2014 onwards, there weren't many protection mandated agencies with a capacity to deliver services in the northeast Nigeria. I mean, throughout 2014, we faced difficulties even accessing information that didn't come through perhaps church networks. When MSF established an office, information became a little stronger. I think the challenge of understanding what was going on in order to put together an analysis and develop plans for assistance was really a challenge there. I also think there was a lack of clarity on where the protection risks were coming from. We were aware, of course, of the protection risks related to Boko Haram, but before the scale-up in 2014, where we saw the abduction of girls, for example, Boko Haram were targeting boys' schools. They were targeting ordinary civilians from Maiduguri, the city that had pushed them out earlier on. There was a lot of targeting of Christian communities, but in the way that we analyse and understand the conflict dynamics in late 2014 with the surge of Boko Haram through in Borno State and in northern Adamawa and eastern Yobe, where they put together the caliphate and declared that for some amount of time. The patterns weren't as clear earlier in the crisis, and I think it was yet another obstacle to agencies and protection agencies understanding the scale of that crisis. But I think when we see, at the point at which it became a food security crisis, and the Cadre Amenuise in November 2015 had a figure of nearly 50,000 people in IPC Phase 5. And I think from November 2015 onwards, we had far more of a food security-focused lens on the crisis, and that's when we got more attention. And so whilst I wholeheartedly agree with Jan's statement that this is a protection crisis, this is not the first time that it has been a protection crisis. And I do worry that part of the roots of why it's an overlooked crisis is the protection element within it. And I do think that it will continue to be a food security and nutrition crisis, particularly if forced returns take place to areas where people can't access basic services or humanitarian assistance. But I wonder if we've learnt sufficiently from the experiences of 2013 to 2015 that we will be able to maintain even the profile the crisis currently has in 2017 in order to address the roots of the crisis, as Toby said, and the protection elements of the crisis.
Before I move on, Toby, did you have any comments on what Joe's said just now? You don't have to, just giving you the opportunity.
Perhaps on the very... No, then carry on, crack on, and I'll come in later.
Okay, I'll be watching. You can give me the signal. I just wondered, Joe, also before I move on, and we don't have Chitra on the line yet. Oh, that's a shame. Because you said that, I think you said in your article that there has been an increase in gender-based violence programming in northeast Nigeria, but there's still a protection gap, as you've said, especially for women and girls in these complex situations. I mean, what do you think is the way forward? I mean, how can we tackle this systemic problem? Because I think part of what you highlight in your article is there is this kind of systemic issue here where there isn't enough food, for example, or women and girls can't provide enough food, and so then they're vulnerable and they're exploited, and it goes on. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, and of course this was a key point of discussion at the Oslo Humanitarian Conference on the Lake Chad Basin, which was held in February of this year, is that we need an immediate timeline for the transition from military to civilian coordination of the humanitarian response, I think, and the leadership from the mandated agencies within the Nigerian government. Because I think we do struggle at the moment to line up the work that is taking place in areas under civilian control, including Maiduguri, and the work that takes place with the various civilian authorities, including the National Emergency Management Agency, their state-level counterparts, as well as the presidential Committee on Northeast Initiatives and the Victim Support Fund, with then the Nigerian military, who are of course responsible for the coordination of the majority of humanitarian assistance in Borno State, because the camps, as Jan mentioned, in provincial towns within Borno State are not yet secure enough to transfer to civilian control. And as Natalie has pointed out in her article, as well as a number of others, we rely on civil-military coordination mechanisms in order to engage with the military on issues of security and humanitarian access. But we don't actually have those mechanisms in place for coordinating with the military on issues of humanitarian assistance, because we have those structures in place for civilian authorities. It's a shame that Chitra wasn't able to join, because of course this is a situation that the Center for Civilians in Conflict know very well, because they provide human rights training and capacity building for the Nigerian military through a DFID-supported project, which doesn't include training on humanitarian principles and international standards related to camp coordination and camp management, for example, distribution of food assistance. And so, I mean, I think that has been the very clear message that has come forward from humanitarian agencies throughout the course of 2017 and was raised as early as 2015, in November 2015, when we became aware that these camps were being established inside military barracks or near military barracks. And we foresaw a lot of the complications that arose with insufficient basic services in place and the public health emergency that would take place, as well as the extreme nutrition and food security emergency. But without that being a part of the humanitarian coordination structures in place with the host government, it's not possible to address them in a joined-up way.
Thanks, Joe. I think we do have Chitra online now, which is wonderful. So she's going to join us by phone. Is that right? Okay. Chitra, welcome.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person to join you all.
Well, thank you so much for making the time. I know you're either in an airport or you're en route to a place where you can recover after your trip. But thank you so much for making the time. Chitra, just in case our connection ends up being a bit sporadic, I want to get right into my questions for you, if that's okay.
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to start with your article, which I thought was really interesting. In it, you outlined three main ways in which the Nigerian armed forces are failing to protect communities living through the conflict in northeast Nigeria. And I wondered if you could tell us what these are and why the Nigeria armed forces aren't doing more to protect civilians. And also, what needs to be done to ensure that civilian protection becomes a priority for the Nigerian military?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Wendy. First of all, to say that this analysis is based on research that we did back in 2015, as well as work that we've been doing in the country since then. And for us, the three main ways in which the Nigerian military could improve, or the gaps that we see at present, are number one, that the Nigerian armed forces can and should do more to protect civilians from harm from armed opposition groups. In reality, we've heard lots of stories of the military not being able to protect civilians from violence, in some cases leaving civilians to fend for themselves, when an armed opposition group is in the area or an attack is imminent. The second way, or the second gap that we see, is the failure to prevent collateral damage during their military operations, causing both direct and indirect harm. And the third way is direct targeting of civilians themselves. And I know that we are aware of some of the human rights violations and abuses that have been reported by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others, of sexual violence against women and girls, detention without trial, harassment, destruction of property, and the indiscriminate targeting of particular groups, such as young men in particular. And I think, to answer the second part of your question, which is why are the armed forces not doing more to protect civilians? I think we need to start off by acknowledging what they are doing to protect civilians. So there's increasingly an acknowledgement at all ranks of the Nigerian military that this is important and this is something that the armed forces need to commit to doing and figure out what that means in practice. So we have a draft civilian protection policy at the moment awaiting signature from the presidency. We have the Nigerian armed forces asking us as Civic for help and assistance in terms of how to integrate civilian protection into the training offered by the training schools and colleges. And we also have a revision of the rules of engagement to look at and integrate issues of international humanitarian law and really kind of pass that down to the soldiers. But I think one of the biggest challenges to the Nigerian military in northeast Nigeria is that of distinction. And this is why our 2015 research is entitled When You Can't See the Enemy, Civilians Become the Enemy. And I think that there is a real issue there about the Nigerian state not being able to distinguish between members of armed opposition groups and civilians. And we have to remember that unlike in other situations, what we're seeing in northeast Nigeria is very new for Nigeria. So Nigeria hasn't had this scale of violent conflict for very many years. And it is difficult to see who members of armed opposition groups are, who civilians are. And I think the Nigerian military is coming to grips with what that means in the context of northeast Nigeria. And in terms of what the Nigerian military needs to do, we would say really looking at making sure there's a commitment that is translated into practice at all levels of the Nigerian armed forces. So that includes integration of civilian protection into training that's offered, into pre-deployment instructions, really kind of grappling with this principle of distinction and what that means in practice in northeast Nigeria. One of the biggest issues that we see when it comes to the interaction between the military operational in the northeast and civilian population is the commission of sexual violence, exploitation and abuse by the military. And I'm sure Joe has talked about this a bit already, but there needs to be a lot more done to really translate the prohibitions that we already have in Nigerian law, for example, in the Armed Forces Act, into reality. And we know that all Nigerians going to serve in UN peacekeeping operations abroad get training on sexual exploitation and abuse. But actually, that doesn't necessarily apply to soldiers deployed within the country itself. And in my experience, the institutional culture around this is a bit uneven. So whereas people will say that sexual exploitation is not allowed, in practice, we do find a fair level of acceptance and tolerance that this will happen. And so to me, that needs to change. And then finally, I would say we need to really look, or the military needs to look at how it can rebuild trust and confidence amongst the civilian population. To a large extent, the situation today is better than it has been in the past. And so civilians themselves will talk about how the military has changed compared to 2 or 3 years ago. But there needs to be a lot more proactive community engagement. And by that, I don't mean just interacting with traditional and religious leaders, but with a wide cross-section of the community, people from different ethno-linguistic groups and women as well as men.
Thanks, Chitra. Just quickly, because we're running a bit short of time and I want to give John a chance here, I just wondered if you, because you've been leading on civics work with the Nigerian military to improve protection for civilians caught up in conflict, I wondered if you could just briefly talk about some of the approaches that you've used, because you're really at the front line here, and what impact do you think these are having?
Well, I would say that our approach really is three-pronged. So we work at the policy level. So, for example, the Nigerian military asked us for assistance in drafting or helping them to draft a civilian protection policy. I mentioned this earlier. So that's really ensuring and expressing commitment at the highest levels of both military and political levels of commitment to protect civilians and implement this commitment in practice. The second is looking at the institutional and integrating an awareness of what civilian protection looks like in the course of operations through the training that soldiers receive. And as I may have mentioned before, we're in partnership with the training schools and colleges to do this, and recently held a successful curriculum development consultation with them. So that should be rolling out in the coming months. And the third area is really focusing on working with the military operational in the Northeast Theatre. And by this, I mean running workshops and training for them, looking at what civilian protection means in practice in the context of the Northeast operations, but also working with civilians in the same localities as the soldiers that we're working with. So we provide training to civilian communities on self-protection, so what they can do to protect themselves in case of attack. And then finally, we do work bringing civilians and security forces, that's primarily the military, but also the police, the Civil Defense Corps, immigration, and any other security agencies that are operational in that place, together in civil military forums to discuss issues of threats to human security that the communities themselves have identified. And the aim of this is really to have a two-way dialogue between civilians and security forces, which doesn't happen otherwise, and then really engage in action planning to see what can be done about some of the issues that are raised. So, for example, if one of the issues that has been raised is the use of force to control crowds during food distribution. And so we engaged in a process where the security agencies and the civilians present sat down together to work out what a better scenario could be to ensure crowd management, which didn't lead to injury and loss of life on the part of the civilian population, caused by, I would say, the inability of actors involved in food distribution to be able to undertake crowd control.
Thank you very much, Petra. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to stay on the line.
I'll try, stay online, and let's see how well the connection holds up.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. John, in 2014, I understand that IRC was one of the first agencies to open operations in Mubi, responding to IDPs from Borno State and northern Adamawa State. I mean, was this decision motivated by the response to Nigerian refugees by IRC offices in other countries in the Lake Chad region?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it ties in with the evolution of the response. IRC initially set up in Niger, in the southeastern Difa, and then recognising the needs both of Nigerian refugees fleeing from Borno, but also Nigerian displaced people, decided to intervene in northeast Nigeria, and then latterly also in the northern part of Cameroon as well.
Because I don't think there were many other agencies who were there, if any, were there?
Well, as I mentioned just a moment ago, I mean, initially it was quite an invisible crisis.
Yes.
And then happily in more recent times, the last year or so, there's been a real proliferation of different agencies intervening, which is great.
And I know, I mean, we've talked a bit about your role in adaptive programming and some of the research that you're doing as well. And your colleague, Matthias Meyer, wrote an article for us based on, I think, a brief that you actually put together initially and on his own experience, which speaks to IRC's experience of using an adaptive program approach to overcome some of the challenges of working in DIFA in Niger. And I wondered if you could describe for us what some of the distinguishing features of adaptive humanitarian programming are and how it's been used in the IRC DIFA response.
Sure. So for the first part of your question, in terms of looking at adaptive humanitarian programs more generally, I'd say they're characterized firstly by building flexibility into the design and resourcing of an intervention. Secondly, they have a strong focus on learning, so ongoing analysis of different data such as security data, project monitoring data, client and partner feedback, all feed into decisions about whether or not to adapt. And then finally, critical piece is having implementation which is agile. And that doesn't mean you just change on a whim. It's having that data analysis really driving changes, whether they be iterative improvements or more substantive shifts in program implementation.
And I suppose your donors and your staff and everyone has to understand this approach and be prepared to actually use it.
Absolutely. So the research we conducted identified a number of different enablers of adaptive programs. One is having trusting and flexible partnerships with donors, but also with local agencies and importantly local authorities. It's about having those that flexibility of funding and remit to be able to change your approach. But then also having a culture and a leadership which values data, which creates an authorizing environment for changes to be made is really crucial.
And how did this work in DIFA? How did you adapt it or use it in DIFA?
Okay, so DIFA is, as many of you I'm sure know, a horrendously complex context, but I think Matthias, the country director for Niger, developed a very simple, straightforward approach, which was, firstly, they need to really understand and monitor the changing situation and then be able to quickly respond to the needs of those affected by Boko Haram violence. I think a really important reflection early on from the team was that to be effective, they really needed to be able to analyse the changing dynamics of the situation. And they did this by building a great partnership with a local organisation who jointly established an information network. Joe spoke earlier of the challenges of information, and I think this was one of the workarounds that the team there came up with. So they worked to establish protection monitors in different communities along the border with Nigeria. They also recognised the importance that they couldn't just sit on this information. They needed to act and also advocate very quickly. They needed to act quickly because the information they were receiving was about life-threatening situations. But they also needed to advocate, and that's both to the donors to enable effective resourcing, but also to other organisations to ensure that there's a coordinated response. And so what they did was, building off this information network, they were able to rapidly deploy multi-sectoral needs assessment teams, and then that information was shared with UN OCHA, who were able to coordinate a more effective response. The third piece, I think, which was a real distinguishing feature of the IRC's programme in DIFA, was that they, amidst the crisis, they were able to pause and reflect. And that's not easy to do.
No.
I was fortunate to be with the Niger team in early 2014 when they were conducting some scenario planning of how the situation could evolve. And they were able to identify 4 different scenarios, 3 of which actually came to pass in the coming 6 months. But this wasn't an academic exercise. They were using this anticipatory information to really inform their preparations and how they had evolved the programming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting, and I urge you to read that article because it really is an interesting one. Before I open up the floor to the rest of the audience, Toby, do you have any other points or reflections you'd like to make now?
No, let's go to the audience.
Great. Okay. Well, we've had some interesting input from our panelists. Jan's video message, which I think really set the scene.